Hi guys, in this video I've begun the sub-assemblies for the Bimota Tesi 1D, and where possible with any kit, especially so motorbike and car kits, it's always a good idea to look at through the entire assembly manual and look at all of the sub-assemblies that you can put together that are going to be sprayed a uniform colour. Such as the engine, it's daft trying to paint the individual parts on the sprue and then gluing it together and expect a clean result. So engines typically can be almost completely assembled from the sprue and then painted as a whole, with quite often with small detail picked out with a brush later. Sometimes it's handy to paint separate components separately and stick them on after, things like the oil filter and the starter motor that you see there that I have mounted separately for spraying. So they're going to be picked out in a very slightly different colour to the rest of the engine, so that they're a bit more noticeable. But where possible, it's good to make sub-assemblies. Now, speaking of sub-assemblies, it actually looks as if I'm a little further on than I really am, because as you can see down here, I've got the frame, the trellis frame, the engine block, and the body and exhausts all together here. The reason for this, I'm not actually that far on with this at all. This is just the first stage. I've not even done any priming as yet. The reason this is like this is because I wanted to assemble the exhaust system into a complete system, so I can paint the entire thing as one complete system before fixing it. And to do this, it needs to be assembled on the bike, so that you know everything's going to fit. So we've got 2 exhaust pipes at the front cylinder, 2 exhaust pipes at the rear cylinder, and then the 2 exhaust silencer cans on exhaust hangers, which are on the trellis frame. To make sure all this lined up properly, this entire thing needed to be assembled, and the body, which you see down here, is on solely for the purpose of keeping the trellis frame and everything else in place while the glue dries on this exhaust system. So once that's completely dry, I can take all this apart again and clean up the join lines, which are here, here and here on the exhaust, so they're not going to be glaringly obvious, as they would be if you painted them separately and assembled them afterwards. And then I can paint the exhaust assembly as a complete unit. So that's the reason for that. In a similar fashion, I'm just going to slide that over there, in a similar fashion I've done something along the same lines with the rear wheel assembly. What I've got there is the chain, the brake disc, the brake caliper and the rear swing arm and wheel all connected together, just fastened by a screw as they would be in the final assembly, so that I could stick together and accurately fit the paddock stand that you can see down there. Because although you could use something like a square to make sure that the joins are square, it's easier and better if you can fit it up to the item it's going to connect to. And because the connecting pieces that go into the swing arm, the bobbins or whatever you want to call them, are not that large on this kit. On some kits they're much larger and you've got much more leeway. Well, they're not so large on this kit, and it's a very sort of thin, spindly paddock stand, this one, compared to some of the kits I've done. So I wanted to make sure that that would fit accurately, and to do that I made up a jig for fitting it by assembling the components it's going to connect to. And then again, once that's dry, I can take all this apart ready for priming. So that's where we're at the moment. The next stage is going to be a little bit more cleanup and mounting some parts for paint. One thing to mention there, this is the front mudguard, front fender assembly, and when that was glued together there was a noticeable gap, very, very small but noticeable gap along the seam line at the front there. That was filled using super glue, just running a bead of super glue across there, leaving that to set and then sanding it flush. As you can see, that little black line there is basically where there's a bit of grime in there where it's set with the super glue, but that's nice and smooth now. So once that's primered and painted, you'll not be able to see that seam line. And the other thing I've done is drilling out the brake discs, which hopefully you can see there as I move that around. On the rear and both front discs I've drilled out the ventilation holes, and on the front discs I've drilled out the slightly larger bobbin holes, which the cotton reel bobbins, which would hold the floating disc onto the brake disc assembly. So once that's all painted up, the bobbins and the centre can be picked out in a different colour to make that stand out, but that gives a much more realistic finish than the moulded dimples, although you can use a black wash to highlight those, but I do prefer to drill them out where possible. It just gives a much more realistic finish to the disc. So at this point here, the various bits have been glued and set and disassembled, and as you can see, we have the completed and correctly set paddock stand. So that will now sit onto the swing arm accurately, with the pins locating in the holes properly. The rear swing arm, as you can see there, has been glued together with a corresponding piece in the middle. The front swing arm has been glued together, and the engine, or as much of the engine as can be assembled for a single colour with a couple of highlight details which will be brush painted, has been glued together. And the frame, having looked at the instructions and a good sort of look at the before and after, I've figured that I should be able to get away with gluing the upper frame, subframe together. So I've done that, and there were a couple of gaps to fill. There's a lot of seam lines on this kit to clean up, on the exhaust pipes especially, on all of the pipes and the silencers where they fit together. There's a lot of seam lines to clean up, which you can do so with your scalpel or hobby knife, just scraping along those, and then a little bit of shaping to make sure you keep them as round as possible. Also, the little gaps, which hopefully you can see here, just in front of the silencers on the inner portion, which are hollow, I've filled those so that they don't stand out as a hollow piece so much. They shouldn't be too visible, but you will be able to see them if you look carefully. So they've been filled. That's the exhaust set. And as you can see, about as I was talking about the complex nature of the curves, with 2 pipes going to each cylinder. Now that's set in place, and that will just clip in place when it's all painted up, but that means I can paint the entire assembly as one piece. Everything else that I'm ready for painting at the moment has been pegged on pieces of sprue, as you can see. There's a couple more bits to do yet, but we've got the fairing panels and various other parts of the fairing, the exhaust, the wheels, and so on. So now we're ready to put some primer down on some of the parts. And here in the drying box, you see we've got quite a number of parts in primer, waiting either a bit more attention or a coat of paint. Some of the body panels are going to need a little bit of clean up, where there are some scratches and such, and this is the useful part of primer. Is when you lay your first coat of primer down on things, it will, because it gives an even coverage over everything. This is why primer is so important, not just for the base, a good base for paint, but it will show up any flaws or errors. And there are some fine scratches on some of the body panels and some marks and what have you that I'm going to need to clean up and then reprime before I go to paint on those. Some of the other parts are fine, the rear and front swing arm, the engine block and so on. So once they're dried completely, they'll be ready for paint.